Okay, ready to talk about airway resistance. So on Tuesday, we finished up talking about the act of breathing, how we inspire and expire, which relates to what we call Boyle's Law. Boyle's Law that states that there's an inverse relationship between pressure inside of a closed container and the volume. If, for example, volume goes up, like what happens when our diaphragm contracts, pressure drops, and that's what allows us to breathe in. When volume goes down, pressure goes up, and that's what allows us to exhale. Okay. Let's talk now about airway resistance, which is kind of a continuation of what we talked about in our previous lecture on the blood vessels, something that you'll want to know for Tuesday, which was vascular resistance. Kind of the same principles are involved here. So reading through like the flow of blood through blood vessels, the rate of airflow through airways depends on both pressure gradient and what we call resistance. Resistance affects both inspiration, breathing in, and expiration, breathing out. Our walls of the airways, especially our bronchioles, which are airways within our lungs, offer some resistance to the normal flow of air into and out of our lungs. The larger the diameter of the airways, the less resistance they have. So like your trachea, your windpipe has the least amount of resistance, which is just like what we saw with blood vessels. The bigger vessels have less resistance. Your smaller ones, especially like your arterioles, your capillaries, your venules, they're tiny, and so flow of blood is more difficult. So we say resistance is higher. As our lungs expand during inhalation or inspiration, not insulation, that's not a word relating to this. Inspiration, the bronchioles enlarge because their walls are pulled upward in all directions. Airway resistance then increases during expiration as the diameter of our bronchioles decreases. Airway diameter is also regulated by degree of contraction or relaxation of some muscle in the walls of our airways, and it's just like what we saw with blood vessels, what we call vasodilation and vasoconstriction. This time we call it bronchodilation, bronchoconstriction. Okay. Our sympathetic nervous system producing that fight or flight response causes relaxation of the bronchiolar smooth muscle that lines our bronchial tree. We call this bronchodilation and decreases resistance. So just like what we saw with vasodilation. Whereas signals from the parasympathetic division causes contraction or bronchiolar smooth muscle, resulting in bronchoconstriction and an increase in resistance. So it's kind of actually flipped from what we talked about with regards to sympathetic, parasympathetic when it was blood vessels. We said that, blood vessels, when activated by the sympathetic nervous system, especially in like your skin, your digestive organs, your urinary organs, we vasoconstrict. Well, now we see when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, we bronchodilate. So we dilate instead of constrict our airways, which should make sense because when we are in a fight or flight response, we need more oxygen into our body and we need to remove more CO2, right? Okay, and we need more air coming in and out so that we can use that oxygen to make more energy to contract our muscles so that we can fight or flight. And then in a rest and digest response, like you guys are all in a state of right now, we're, having some slight degrees of bronchoconstriction. Resistance is a little bit more elevated. Any condition that narrows or obstructs our airways increases resistance so that more pressure is required to maintain the same airflow. Hallmark of both asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, which includes emphysema or bronchitis, is increased airway resistance due to obstruction or collapse of airways. We'll talk a little bit more about all of those, emphysema, bronchitis, asthma, here in a couple slides. After we talk about what we call pulmonary volumes. Okay, so volume is a term we've been talking about here for the last few weeks. We talked a lot about like blood volume, which we described as like the amount of blood that we have. We have pulmonary volumes, measuring amount of air that we can breathe in and out of our lungs or what's in our lungs. while at rest, a healthy adult averages about 12 breaths per minute. So 12 of those inhale, exhales, combinations. With each inhalation, exhalation, we move a specific amount or volume of air into our lungs, which can be measured using what we call a spirometer. And 4 things can be measured using a spirometer: tidal volume, expiratory reserve volume, inspiratory reserve volume, residual volume. And really that's kind of misleading because you technically can't measure the last one, and I'll explain why in just a second. First one, tidal volume. Think of that like the tide of an ocean where you have waves going up and down, right? This is what it looks like when you measure it. It looks like little waves going up and down. What the machine is pretty cool. There's more sophisticated ones that you find in like hospital settings. You can also get much simpler ones. But basically what you do is you have a mouthpiece that you breathe into, in and out, in and out, in and out. At the same time, you got to have your nose plugged so no air is escaping out and in through your nose. So all the air that's moving is going through the tube that you have your mouth around. You breathe in, the volume goes up, then you breathe out, in, out, in, out, in, out. And that's what tidal volume is. And so the actual amount of air that you're measuring is the amount of air that you normally expire after typical inspiration. So like take a take a normal breath in and then blow it out. What you just blew out is your tidal volume. It's about a half a liter, 500 mils. About 70% of that actually reaches the respiratory zone to undergo gas exchange, goes to those little grape-like alveoli that I talked a little bit about last time. The other 30%, about 150 mils, remains in what we call the conducting zone, which, remember, the conducting zone we mentioned a little bit last time is going to be, the parts that don't perform gas exchange from your nose down to your terminal bronchioles. So really, that 150 mils really doesn't do anything for us because it never makes its way to be exchanged with the blood, which is why another term for the conducting zone is your anatomical or respiratory dead space. Not that it's actually dead tissue, obviously, it's just, as far as respiration goes, serves really no purpose for gas exchange. Expiratory reserve volume, ERV, is the largest additional volume of air that a person can forcibly expire after expiring tidal volume air. So you measure that by, taking an exhale out, and then after you feel like you've just taken that normal breath out, then you just blow everything else out that you can. Okay, which is a little over a liter in males, a little under a liter in females, 1,200 mils, 700 mils. Basically, the opposite of that is IRV, inspiratory reserve volume, the amount of air that can be forcibly inspired over and above a normal inspiration. So here's your normal inspiration, and then you suck all the way in from that normal breath in all the way up to the top where you think your lungs are completely full is your inspiratory reserve volume. And that's quite a bit. Over 3 liters in men, not quite 2 liters in women. And then residual volume, I said you can't actually measure this, and that's because this is the air that's stuck in your lung. It actually cannot be forcefully expired. So if you huff and puff and blow everything off that you can, there's actually air left in your lungs. Okay, and that's great because this still allows for gas exchange to occur between breaths, even if you feel like your lungs are empty. They're not. Okay? So we can say this is the volume of air left in our lungs after maximal expiration, and it's a pretty good amount, over a liter in both men and women, 1,200 mils, 1,100 mils in females. Okay. Now you can take these and you can perform calculations and calculate out what we call pulmonary capacities. So you basically you can't technically measure these without measuring volumes first. And then using those volumes, you can add them together and come up with these capacities. First is called vital capacity. It's the largest volume of air an individual can move in and out of the lungs. Vital capacity is represented in our figure here with these three bracketed off parts. Your IRV, inspiratory reserve volume, plus your tidal volume, plus your expiratory reserve volume. So essentially, it's the amount of air that you can breathe in after you've felt like you've completely emptied your airways, or emptied your lungs. Inspiratory capacity is the maximum amount of air an individual can inspire after a normal expiration. So it's after you take a normal exhale out, breathe in as deep as you can. That's what that is. It's tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume. Functional residual capacity is the amount of air left in your lungs at the end of a normal expiration. So when you take that normal exhale out, what's left in your lungs is that expiratory reserve volume plus the residual volume. And then total lung capacity is probably the most common sense. It's the total amount of blood that your lungs can hold. Pretty good amount there, 6 liters and 4.2 liters. As far as the numbers go, I'm not going to worry about you knowing them. I took a class when I was in grad school over respiratory physiology. We had to learn all of them. I couldn't tell you them to this day right off the top of my head. I don't expect you guys to know this unless you're going to be like a pulmonary specialist. This isn't going to be something that's necessary to know. So what I want you to know for the volumes, just know the definition of them, what they mean. Same thing for capacities. I'm not going to have you worry about calculating anything out or anything like that. I'm not going to ask you what's the formula for calculating vital capacity. Just know what the description of it is. Make sense? Okay. All right. On top of that, a spirometer can also provide us with additional information about airflow in an individual. Which includes total minute volume, which is just the volume of air moved per minute. It's kind of like cardiac output, which we learned cardiac output's the amount of blood that's pumped per minute. We really don't necessarily do, I shouldn't say we, I'm not a pulmonologist or anybody that does any of this stuff, but I did grow up with asthma, so I didn't know it at the time, but I was being tested using a spirometer. What is a lot of times used, and it's very, very clinically helpful, is what we call forced expiratory volume, FEV for short, which is the volume of air forcibly expired during different times. The most important of which is FEV1, the volume of air that you blow off during your first second of exhaling. Here's what I can basically explain it as. So here's a spirometer measurement. Person's breathing in as deep as possible, and I remember doing this as a kid. They would say, take a deep breath in, breathe in, breathe in, breathe in, breathe in, breathe in, fill your lungs, and then they say, okay, blow as hard as you can, as fast as you can. A person with normal, good lungs and airways can blow off almost all that air that they have under 1 second. Whereas somebody with like COPD, that resistance is so high that their lungs, it's like they're breathing out through a straw. It's harder to empty their lungs. And even after 3 seconds, FEV3, they still have only emptied out a fraction of what that person did with normal lungs and normal airways after 1 second. I did this every time I went to the doctor. I just didn't know it, but I have that burning memory in my head of being told breathe in as fast and hard as you can, and then breathe out as hard and fast as you can. And if you also had to go to the asthma doctor, you remember it as well. Okay, let's talk about disorders of the respiratory system, which we'll talk on this page about what we call restrictive and obstructive disorders. Restrictive disorders are those that cause that abnormally low vital capacity. So looking back, what vital capacity was, largest volume of air an individual can move in and other lungs. So vital capacity was basically the amount of air that you can breathe in after you feel like you've emptied your lungs. So vital capacity really is kind of an inspiring situation, whereas obstructive disorders are those that cause that abnormally low FEV1 that we just talked about, having an inability to exhale that air out really rapidly in 1 second. Examples of restrictive obstructive disorders include COPD, short for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It's got obstructive in the name, so that's going to be kind of a dead giveaway. But actually, COPD is both restrictive and obstructive. COPD is a disorder characterized by chronic and recurrent obstruction of airflow, which causes an increase in airway resistance. There are two primary types of COPD: bronchitis, which I have an illustration here on the next page to show what a person with chronic bronchitis experiences. Basically, they just have mucus that's in their airways, kind of clogging up things, whereas a normal, healthy airway is nice and wide open. The alveoli, those little clusters of grape-like structures, are a little bit more inflated, whereas on the left there, for a normal airway and alveoli, they're not. So the key with bronchitis, excessive tracheobronchial secretions that obstruct the airflow. Emphysema occurs when the airspace is distal to the terminal bronchioles are enlarged as a result of damage to lung connective tissue. People with emphysema contain abnormally large air spaces in their alveoli that remain filled with air during inhalation. And they look like they've just, when you've overinflated a balloon, those little clusters of grapes, those little alveoli are now just big overinflated things, and you can't squeeze them down and empty them. We talked about this the other day, or I talked about this as like having that waistband that's stretched out when you've got, a pair of sweats that you've had for years and years and years and you can't let go of them. Asthma, shown over there on the left, is a disorder I've already mentioned, characterized by chronic airway inflammation, airway hypersensitivity to a variety of stimuli. It just means that the airways are they have an allergic reaction to stimuli, resulting in airway obstruction. This may be due to muscle spasms in the walls of the smaller bronchi or in bronchioles, edema, which is swelling of the mucosa of the airways, increased mucus secretion, or damage to the epithelium of the airways. So essentially, the airway is just kind of clogged up, whether it's from mucus, whether it's due to muscle contractions causing bronchoconstriction. A lot of different things are involved. So it's kind of similar to bronchitis, except there's a lot of allergy-related things with asthma. And that was the case for me, I kind of was lucky I got older. My asthma really kind of got better. But when I, have my seasonal allergies or when I'm around a cat, my asthma, I can feel it flaring up. It's not a pleasurable situation. Over on the right, table 22.3 is something I included, showing you various changes to respiratory rhythm. So we've been talking about breathing rhythm a little bit, so I included this. A lot of this is not really that important to know. We will talk about hyper and hypoventilation later in this lecture. Hyperventilation, remember hyper means high or elevated. So this is just a fancy way to describe faster breathing rate. Hypoventilation is just low breathing rate or slower breathing rate. Apnea is something that we all experience. This is a temporary cessation of breathing. You may have heard of like sleep apnea before. People suffer from that where they actually stop breathing in their sleep. But I said we all experience this. We'll talk about like how if you like jump in a cold pool, it like takes your breath away, and it literally does for not a long period of time, thankfully. Dyspnea is just a fancy way to describe labored, gasping breathing, shortness of breath. like when you're out of shape and you go for a run. A lot of these other ones, I'm not even going to talk about. So we'll just move on to hypoxia again for another time this semester. We've talked about hypoxia before, back when we learned about the making of blood, red blood cells specifically. We learned that hypoxia was one of the stimuli that resulted in the production of more red blood cells. Hypoxia, remember, is just a fancy word for low blood oxygen levels. It can be caused by several different things. There's actually several different forms of hypoxia, obviously listed here on this page. Hypoxemic hypoxia is a state of low arterial PO2. PO2 is short for pressure of oxygen. Essentially what that means is just a state of low oxygen in your arteries, usually due to inadequate pulmonary gas exchange, which can be caused by going to high elevations or just having impaired ventilation. Ischemic hypoxia, ischemia always is a term that refers to like a decrease in blood flow. So hypoxia that results from inadequate circulation of blood would be what ischemic hypoxia is. And then anemic hypoxia, we learned in our last unit when we talked about blood that anemia isn't necessarily low iron, although the most common form of anemia is low iron. Anemia is the culprit here that causes hypoxia in many cases, resulting in an inability of our blood to carry oxygen. Pretty much anybody that's anemic would be at great risk for being hypoxic as well, because anemia is just decreased ability of their blood to carry oxygen, so more than likely they're going to be hypoxic as a result. Okay, so we've been talking about alveoli. I introduced them last time, the primary structures for gas exchange of our respiratory tract. I want to talk a little bit more about their anatomy and what all goes into what we call pulmonary or external respiration, where we transfer oxygen from the lumen of an alveolus through the wall of that alveolus and into the pulmonary capillaries, which we show a sac here with those pulmonary capillaries surrounding it, but these other three sacs, they don't show the blood vessels. You have to keep in mind, this is just a simplified image. These dense networks of blood vessels will be around each and every one of these alveoli, just like they are here in this picture. They just didn't include it in the other ones, but no big deal. Okay, in our earlier lecture, or earlier part of this lecture, I mentioned that an alveolar sac was like a cluster of grapes. The grapes would be the alveoli. That's what I have here for this bold. An alveolar duct is kind of like a stem of a cluster of grapes. In this case, it's not a stem, but it's actually an airway. It carries that oxygen into the alveolar sac from the very tips of our bronchial tree, what we call our terminal bronchioles. And then CO2 is going to go the opposite way on its way up and out of our body when we exhale. The walls of alveoli are very thin, allowing for gas exchange to occur with very little resistance, which is great. We want the flow of oxygen from our alveoli into the blood to be very easy, and CO2 to be very easy going the opposite direction. And I talked about this the other day, but our lungs are made up of millions of alveoli, thus increasing the surface area of gas exchange very high. Okay, let's talk about the respiratory membrane that relates to those alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries that surround them. The respiratory membrane can be thought of as a barrier across which the gases are exchanged, and it consists of 4 layers illustrated here on the next page. What we are looking at here is just a sectioned open alveolus. We see that it's kind of a hollow ball-like structure with blood capillaries kind of around it on all different sets of sides. The place where the oxygen has to go through and into the blood is this respiratory membrane, CO2 going in the opposite direction from our blood into the alveolus. The 4 layers we are zooming in at here in this box are all capitalized here on this part of our figure. It includes what we call type 1 alveolar cells. Type 1 alveolar cells are one of the kind of 2 primary types of cells in our alveoli, the other being type 2s, which I'll talk about down here at the bottom. There's also macrophages, but really type 1s and type 2s, as far as breathing, are the most important. Type 1s are what constitute the majority of the cell or the alveolus's wall. Okay, you see here's one type 1 cell. Here's another. Basically, that's what's forming the outer wall of an alveolus. And look at the shape of the cell. It's a flat plate-like cell, very, 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 very thin. And I say very, very, very. I don't even know if that's enough varies to demonstrate how thin those cells are. Directly on the outside of those is another very thin layer, what we call its basement membrane, which is extracellular material, oops, wrong way, that just underlies the alveolar wall. Now, we already know about capillaries from our previous lecture that they are made up of 2 layers. The capillaries endothelium and then its basement membrane. So those are the other 2 layers of our respiratory membrane. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 layers, and it might sound like that's a lot, but total, these 4 layers are super, 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 super thin. Fractions upon fractions upon fractions. I'll give you actually a measurement of it here in a little bit. It's like 0.0004 millimeters or something like that. So it's basically not even a barrier because it's so thin. And that's great because we want gas exchange to be really easy. We don't want it to be hard for oxygen to go into our blood, CO2 to leave the blood. And now, there's also those type 2 cells that I was mentioning, which produce a fluid called surfactant, which is a fluid inside of the alveoli. Once again, it's produced by type 2 cells, cuboidal epithelial cells interspersed among the type 1 cells. So what is a surfactant? It helps reduce what we call surface tension, which is the force of attraction between water molecules of the fluid. Not that I'm really going to be a harper on what is surface tension. More importantly, here's what surfactant does. Surfactant prevents each alveolus from collapsing and sticking together as we respire. When those pressure changes occur in our lungs as we breathe in and out, it would be easy for those alveoli to kind of collapse and cave in or expand out too far. Surfactant prevents that from happening. And here's really the major takeaway is what it does. In doing so, it allows oxygen to diffuse more easily. So surfactant's super important to aid with that gas exchange. As I mentioned, there's also alveolar macrophages, just like macrophages in other parts of our body. You know, like the Pac-Man cells I've talked about, chewing stuff up, you know, like if dust was, you know, to make its way this far into our lungs, you know, this can help clean it up, bacteria and viruses and that kind of stuff as well. So a lot of anatomy, just to kind of hopefully give you a basis of understanding the structure so that now we can understand function. All right, talking more about gas exchange, which relates to pressure, just like breathing in and out. What is affected by pressure? Total pressure produced by our atmosphere is the sum of the pressures produced by each of its gases, which is predominantly oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide, and that's not listed in order as far as the most to the least, Because by far and away, the most prominent gas in the air that we breathe, doesn't matter where we're at, if we're here in Kansas, if we're at the top of Mount Everest, the majority of the gas that we're breathing in, majority of that air is nitrogen. Okay? And that percentage does not change. That's a thing I always like to point out. People like to say, hey, I climbed the mountain, there was less oxygen in the air. You hear people saying that all the time. You know, they talk about it like when the Chiefs are playing in Denver, which is, you know, Mile High City. They say, oh man, there's less oxygen in the air. It really, truly is not less oxygen in the air. The percentages never change. The percentage of oxygen is always 20.93% if we're looking at dry air. It's a little bit different if it's kind of more wet. But right at 21%. The difference is it's partial pressure. And I'll get to that here in 1 second. Okay. Each gas in a mixture exerts its own pressure as if no other gases were present. We call this law Dalton's law. So last time we talked about Boyle's law. Here's our second law. We have a third law coming up to talk about Dalton's law. Okay. At sea level, barometric pressure of the atmosphere is 760 millimeters of mercury. And this term I just used, partial pressure, is the pressure exerted by any one of those gases in a mixture of gases or liquid. So in other words, each gas has its own pressure. So the air that we're breathing, and I just said, is predominantly nitrogen, but it's also got oxygen, it's got carbon dioxide, there's water, there's other gases. Each of those gases exerts its own pressure, okay? And each gas diffuses across a permeable membrane from area where its partial pressure is greater to the area where its partial pressure is less, which is great lead into what we'll be getting into here in just a little bit. The greater the difference in pressures, the faster the rate of diffusion. So in other words, the bigger the pressure gradient, the faster the rate of diffusion. In an ideal world, the gas of interest, so if we were wanting to measure oxygen partial pressure, we could just remove oxygen and measure it directly, but you can't do that. Okay. So what you have to do is just multiply its percentage times barometric pressure. Okay. So we're multiplying each of these gases, nitrogen, oxygen, water, CO2, times, well, we're multiplying its percentage. Actually, it's not percentage. We've converted it to decimal point. How do you convert percentages to decimal points? You just move the decimal twice to the left, right? So 20.93 becomes 0.09, and they just cut off the 3 because, you know, not that big a difference. And then you multiply that by the barometric pressure. And then what you have over here on the far column, this would be the partial pressure of nitrogen, partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of water, on down. You add those all up, that's what gives you the total barometric pressure. Now you can use a barometer to measure barometric pressure. And like I said, at sea level, which is what we usually typically use because that's kind of just a nice baseline to go with, it's 760 millimeters of mercury, which means that the PO2 pressure of oxygen at sea level is right at 159 millimeters of mercury. Looks like they just rounded up. Or I just rounded up, I should say. Now, is this number going to change when you climb a mountain? Absolutely, it will. This number doesn't change. It's this number that changes that causes this number to change. This is why it feels like it's harder to breathe and why people think there's less oxygen in the air. There's less pressure of oxygen in the air, which is a factor that's going to affect the rate of diffusion of that oxygen into our blood and then into our cells to be made into ATP. Does this number go up or down when you climb a mountain, when you go into higher altitudes? It's going to go down. Higher altitude has less barometric pressure, which means this number is going to also go down. And that relates to our third law. Third law, we call this fixed law of diffusion, which is specific to diffusion, hence the name. States that the amount of gas that moves across a sheet of tissue, or we could say the amount of gas that diffuses across a sheet of tissue, is related to three things. Two of which it's proportional to, one it's inversely proportional to. Okay. Proportional to the difference in gas partial pressure, in other words, the partial pressure gradient between the two sides, which, if I go back to this page, is this bullet right here. The greater the difference, the faster the rate of diffusion. Okay. The bigger the difference, the steeper the hill. And we talked about this in the beginning of the semester. We talked about concentration gradients, how we go from high concentration to low concentration, right? Well, pressure gradients work the same way. The bigger the difference between the two sides, the faster the ball is going to roll down the hill, the faster the diffusion is going to occur. It's also proportional to the tissue area, which if I go back to this slide, I said a normal healthy lung has a very large surface area for gas exchange because of the millions of alveoli each lung have. The more alveoli, the more areas for gases to be exchanged. So proportional, one goes up, the other one goes up. Okay. Inversely proportional means that if one goes up, the other one goes down. Okay. And that's what I have illustrated here at the bottom of this page. Okay. On the left, here's what a normal healthy lung is going to look like. Here's that respiratory membrane that I was talking about. Essentially, we're just zooming in at this portion of our figure. The respiratory membranes, those four layers for which oxygen must travel across and CO2 must travel in the opposite direction for gas exchange to occur. I said normal healthy lung, it's fractions upon fractions upon fractions of a millimeter, right? But look what happens when a person gets a diseased lung. That distance is grown. So think of it in just kind of this analogy. A healthy lung, oxygen has to like walk 2 feet to get where it needs to go. It's like one step, right? Whereas when you have a diseased lung, scar tissue can form, or even fluids can get in that respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane goes up, tissue thickness goes up, diffusion goes down, so now you're not walking 2 feet, you're walking 20 feet. Does that make sense? Okay. With that said, now we have kind of an understanding of the things that affect gas exchange. I want to talk about the two forms of gas exchange. The first of which we call alveolar gas exchange, or external respiration, which if I backtrack again to this page, we're going to talk about step 2 now. So we've brought the oxygen into our lungs, into our alveoli. Now we need to bring it into the blood, and now we need to remove CO2 from the blood into our alveoli. The other gas exchange we're going to talk about after this is number 4, systemic gas exchange. What takes place when that oxygen makes its way to our tissues. We need to leave it from the blood into the tissues, and CO2 can be brought into the blood. We're going to kind of skip number 3 for now, and we'll talk about transporting O2 and CO2 later in the lecture. So for now, let's talk about alveolar gas exchange. Back and forth movement of O2 and CO2 across that respiratory membrane, in other words, between our alveoli and our blood. And the rate of gas exchange is dependent upon several factors. Some of these we just talked about. Okay. First of all, we've just been talking about partial pressure gradient. PO2, and this is all we're going to use at sea level. Okay, that's our baseline. We're not gonna, think about what happens quite yet about going to high altitude. PO2 at sea level is about 104 millimeters of mercury in our alveolar air. So PO2, 104 inside our lungs. It's about 40 millimeters of mercury in the blood that's around and arriving at each alveolus. Pressure gradient exists, right? 104 is bigger than 40, right? Pretty good difference, 64 millimeters of mercury difference, driving that oxygen from our alveoli into the blood. And it's an easy diffusion that takes place. Distance, I was just talking about. Here's where I give you that statistic, how thin that respiratory membrane is. It's very thin, diffusion occurs quickly. Also, capillaries are so narrow that red blood cells must pass through them in single file, minimizing diffusion distance from the alveolar airspace to actually getting into the red blood cell and attaching to the hemoglobin inside. I said the respiratory membrane is essentially a diffusion obstacle, but in a normal healthy lung, it's about 5 microns or 0.0005 millimeters. It's like nothing. I don't even know if it's, you could say it's even paper thin. Might even be thinner than that. I don't even know how thick a piece of paper is, but not very thick is what I'm saying. We said that. Fixed law of diffusion said that. The more surface area or tissue area, the more diffusion takes place. That's what we're talking about here. They should say in a good healthy lung, not good health, or I guess it works, good health, each lung. That makes sense. I guess I was wrong. Each lung has about 70 square meters of respiratory membrane available for gas exchange. I want to say that's about the same, don't quote me on this, but I think I remember reading, it's about the same amount of surface area as a tennis court. That's all the area that you have for gas exchange to take place. Unfortunately, in several pulmonary diseases, surface area can be drastically decreased, thus leading to decreased ability to diffuse oxygen. Now, I'm not going to harp on anybody, but what do we know about a lot of pulmonary diseases? They're self-inflicted, right? Smoking. So I'm not going to harp on anybody, but smoking's bad. You all know it. Just another example of why. Vaping as well, absolutely. Something we haven't talked about is what we call ventilation-perfusion coupling. And ventilation refers to breathing, perfusion refers to blood flow. So coupling means that they go together. So our body's ability to match ventilation or air availability and perfusion or blood availability to each other, which ensures that areas of our lung with air receive blood. Typically, normal healthy lung is not going to have an issue, and the cardiovascular system as well, getting that blood to the lungs. Because what good is it, think of it this way, if you're breathing in air, but you're not allowing for gas exchange to occur because you're not providing your lungs with blood. Solubility of gases, which is something that we'll be talking a little bit more about here in just a little bit. Gases differ in their ability to dissolve in water or our blood in this case, which is almost half water, right at half water. Thankfully, we've got hemoglobin to increase our blood's ability to carry oxygen and to a lesser extent CO2. When oxygen, and I always think of it like giving a piggyback ride, when oxygen takes a piggyback ride on hemoglobin, we call it oxyhemoglobin or abbreviate that HbO2. Hb is short for hemoglobin. O2 obviously for oxygen. So that's just a hemoglobin molecule carrying an oxygen molecule, whereas deoxyhemoglobin, HHB, is hemoglobin with no O2. Okay, here is a figure to show that partial pressure gradient stuff that I've been talking about. Just for the last couple slides here, I said the greater the difference in partial pressure, the faster rate of diffusion. And I talked about how it's proportional to one another. So I'm going to start kind of right here in my figure. What we're looking at is pressure of oxygen. Ambient refers to outside the body, so like what the person's breathing in from the atmosphere at sea level. And we calculated this out by doing this calculation 0.209 times 760. There's your 158, 159, somewhere in that neighborhood. PO2 in the air surrounding us at sea level is right at 158 millimeters of mercury. PO2 in the blood arriving in our alveoli is somewhere around 40. So from 158 to 40, that's a pretty drastic difference. And look at the steepness of the graph here. Okay? What we need to do is get that oxygen from the atmosphere into our blood, right? Okay. Well, at sea level, we don't have much trouble doing that. Diffusion occurs pretty easily. But when we go to high altitude, 3,000 feet, this is kind of weird because you're going down in the figure, but you're actually going up in atmosphere. This is like what happens when you climb a mountain. Climbing a mountain, going up to 3,000 meters or 10,000 feet, the PO2 is now 110. PO2 has gone down quite a bit. PO2 in our blood is not different, but now we're only different of like 70 millimeters of mercury, whereas we were a difference of like 118, right? So is this line as steep as this line? Think of if you just put a ball on this line and a ball on this line. Which one's going to roll faster? This one, right? This is why it's more difficult to like exercise when you're in Denver, when you're at high altitudes. There's not less oxygen in the air. It's one of my just biggest pet peeves that people, I hear it all the time because I watch a lot of sports. And commentators generally don't know what the hell they're talking about. There's just less pressure of oxygen, which affects the diffusion of that oxygen into the blood. Now, you could jump in a hyperbaric chamber and crank up the PO2 up crazily and make your gradient extremely steep and making it crazy easy to get that O2 into the blood. But obviously that's not really feasible like it is to just be at sea level versus, you know, whatever 3,000 meters, 10,000 feet is. So does that kind of make a little bit of sense? Okay. All right, so that was gas exchange in our lungs. Getting that oxygen into the blood, leaving the CO2 out of the blood or taking it out of the blood and putting it into your lungs to be exhaled. Now we're going to talk about gas exchange with our systemic tissues. So like at our muscles when we're exercising or in our brain where we need to now move that O2 out of the blood and feed our cells and take that CO2 from our cells and put it into the blood. So we say unloading and loading, unloading of O2, loading of CO2 at our systemic capillaries. Same things affect it here. PO2, PCO2 if we're talking about carbon dioxide. PO2 of our blood in our systemic capillaries is higher, about 100 millimeters of mercury, and this is all at sea level. PO2 of our tissue is about 40 because our cells are constantly using O2 to produce ATP. Well, 100 versus 40, there's a difference. 60 millimeters of mercury difference, right? Pretty good difference. So diffusion is pretty easy from the capillaries into the tissue cells. Blood CO2, on the other hand, drops to, or blood PO2, I should say, drops to 40 millimeters of mercury once that blood exits our systemic capillaries. Let's just start here and I'll work through oxygen with our two gas exchanges, pulmonary and systemic. We'll actually start here with ambient PO2. Once again, at sea levels, 159 millimeters of mercury. PO2 in our alveoli is 105. 159 is much higher than 105. Oxygen comes into our lungs easily. Into the alveoli. That blood that's coming to our alveoli by way of those pulmonary capillaries has a PO2 of 40. 105 is much higher than 40. Oxygen easily travels into the blood. Picked up by the blood, that PO2 is now 100 in our systemic capillaries. It's only 40 in our cells. It's because our cells are always making ATP with that oxygen. So 100 minus 40, that's 60 millimeters of mercury difference. O2 is rapidly going to diffuse into the cells. While O2 is diffusing out of the systemic capillaries, CO2 is diffusing in the opposite direction. Because our tissue cells are constantly producing CO2, the pressure of carbon dioxide, PCO2, is 45 millimeters mercury, which is only a little bit higher than that of our systemic capillary blood, only 40. So PCO2 of the blood at our capillaries is 40, PCO2 of our cells is 45, but 45 is more than 40, right? So that drives carbon dioxide out into the blood, which causes the PCO2 of that venous blood to now be 45. So when that carbon dioxide in that pulmonary capillaries makes it to our lungs, 45 is higher than 40 in our alveoli. Not a big difference. It's not as drastic of a difference with the oxygen that we saw, but 45 is higher than 40, right? Carbon dioxide exits the blood, enters the alveoli, where it's 40 versus 0.3, and then we can expire it out. The rate of systemic gas exchange. So how fast we perform gas exchange here is all dependent upon these same factors that we just talked about. Partial pressure gradient, which I've been hammering on, diffusion distance, membrane surface area, ventilation perfusion coupling, solubility of gases. Now I'm not going to go through and talk about each one again because we just did. Those same factors are going to control the rate of systemic gas exchange just like they did alveolar gas exchange. Make sense? Okay, now I said going back to this early slide we talked about on Tuesday. We've talked about number 1, pulmonary ventilation. Talked about that on Tuesday. We just finished talking about 2 and 4, pulmonary gas exchange and systemic gas exchange. Cellular respiration number 5, that's going to be a separate lecture, which means we've got number 3 to talk about, and that will wrap us up with learning about respiration, transporting our O2 and CO2 in the blood. We'll start with transporting O2, and then we'll talk about transporting CO2. As a gas enters our blood, it is immediately dissolved in our plasma. However, fluids like our plasma are only able to carry relatively small amounts of gas. So in other words, we can only put so much oxygen, so much carbon dioxide in our blood plasma. So in order to transport a lot of oxygen, a lot of carbon dioxide, we must bind those gas molecules to chemicals in our blood. What chemical am I talking about? Hemoglobin. Okay. I told you guys this here when we talked about our blood lecture, but about 98.5% of our blood, or excuse me, of our oxygen carried in our blood is bound to hemoglobin. 98.5% is not 100%, so that does leave us with about 1.5% that's just dissolved directly in the blood plasma. That's pretty darn minuscule compared to 98.5%. So we're not even going to really focus in on the dissolved in the plasma form of oxygen. We're going to talk about the bound to hemoglobin in the form of oxyhemoglobin, which binding oxygen to hemoglobin is an easily reversible reaction, meaning that we can, and I always think of it like a piggyback ride. Oxygen is taking a piggyback ride on the back of hemoglobin. By jumping on the back of a person, you're jumping on and hitching the ride. And then when you get to the destination, you jump off, right? It's kind of like what hemoglobin does for us. It's a reversible reaction, meaning we can form oxyhemoglobin by bonding that oxygen to hemoglobin. But then when we get to the tissues, we must release it. Okay? And when I say release, a better term for that is dissociate. So it's important to remember that O2 must dissociate from hemoglobin when blood reaches our tissues so that oxygen can leave the red blood cell and then enter the tissues. Each gram of hemoglobin can unite with 1.34 mils of oxygen. If you take a sample of blood, a 100 ml sample, which is a pretty standard unit of measure when it comes to the blood, you're going to find that there's typically about 15 grams of hemoglobin, which means, and we just said 1 gram can unite with 1.34 mils. So in that 100 mils of blood, you take that 15 grams times 1.34, which tells you you can have around 20 mils of oxygen in that 100 mils of blood, or you could say it's about 20% volume of oxygen in that sample of blood. If 15 was instead 18 or 20, what's going to happen to this number? You know, instead of saying 15 times 1.34, you say 20 times 1.34. Goes up, right? Pretty straightforward. If more hemoglobin is present, more oxygen can be transported, and the reverse is true for less. Let's say it's not 15, but it's 10. That number is going to go down, right? But this is kind of the average number, 15 grams. The percent saturation of hemoglobin expresses the average saturation of oxygen or of hemoglobin with oxygen. One test that's a lot of times done in clinical settings is where they put that little clip thing on your finger. Anybody experience that? Anybody know what that is called? Pulse oximeter. They're measuring your oxygen saturation in your blood. Your O2 sat is what they're actually measuring. The oxygen saturation, which we want to be about 97%. In other words, we say that 91 or 97% of arterial blood's hemoglobin is bound to oxygen. And we all know that COVID is running rampant throughout the world, especially here in America. One of the big things that it does to people is it takes that 97% and it knocks it way down, meaning that you're not getting enough oxygen in your blood, and thus you might have to go on oxygen, supplemental oxygen, or God forbid, a ventilator, which at that point is very, very drastic, bad, worst case scenario. Now, there are several factors that determine that percent of oxygen saturation of hemoglobin by affecting what we call affinity. Kind of going back to my analogy of a piggyback ride. When you take a piggyback ride on someone's back, I imagine everybody's either given or taken a piggyback ride before. Jump on someone's back and then you wrap your arms around them, right? How tightly you hold, kind of what I mean when I say affinity with regards to oxygen and hemoglobin. You can have a really loose hold on someone, which means that you're more likely to fall off, right? To dissociate. Or if you really are holding on tight, you're less likely to dissociate. Same thing can happen with oxygen and hemoglobin. The things that can affect this affinity include PO2, which we've been talking about, pressure of oxygen, temperature of the body, pH of the body, and then a chemical called 2,3-BPG, short for bisphosphoglycerate. Here's where it's going to get kind of super complicated. I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible for you. Now, using that analogy of a piggyback ride, oxygen needs to bind tightly to hemoglobin in our lungs. It needs to grab on when it's getting loaded on, right? When it's jumping on the back of hemoglobin, we want oxygen to hold on tight so it's not falling off. But then when we get to our tissues, we need it to let go. We need its grip to be looser, especially our really, really working tissues, which should make sense because like during exercise, when our cells of the muscles need more oxygen to produce ATP, we need to unload more oxygen to our muscle cells. Hemoglobin does not unload the same amount of oxygen to all tissues. It's going to respond to changes in metabolic activity and unload more oxygen to the tissue that need it the most, i.e. skeletal muscle during exercise. Remember I told you I don't like the term deoxygenated blood? Because right now at rest, when that blood's coming back to your heart, it's still about 75% oxygenated. When you exercise maximally, you don't draw out all the oxygen from your blood, even in that drastic situation. You're still going to leave some oxygen down to hemoglobin, just not nearly as much because you're going to pull more out. Now, the most important factor determining how much O2 binds to hemoglobin is its PO2. Increasing it accelerates loading, which is what we do in our lungs, whereas decreasing PO2 promotes oxygen dissociation, what we call offloading, and that's what we do at our tissues. Well, our active tissues consume oxygen rapidly, meaning that PO2 of its fluids stay low, and thus decreased PO2 promotes offloading. That's what we want. Here's what the oxygen dissociation curve looks like that just demonstrates this concept. It's kind of an S-shaped curve that I'll talk a lot about here, and I've got two different figures. It's the same thing. One on the left just kind of shows you a dump truck with some looks like rocks. Those are actually, hemoglobin would be the dump truck. The little circles are the things that look like rocks are the oxygen. They show a person sitting on the couch versus running. That's from a different textbook. The one on the right is from your textbook. Okay, so oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. You'll see that sometimes just said as a oxyhemoglobin curve. Demonstrates this concept. Notice that when tissue PO2 is low, that hemoglobin will give up oxygen or dissociate it with more easily, and that when PO2 is high, hemoglobin with large amounts of oxygen or binds with large amounts of oxygen and is almost 100% saturated. Oxygen consumption by our systemic tissues keeps PO2 very low, setting a pressure gradient existing that drives oxygen into our systemic tissues. Okay, so looking at our figure, notice I said it's kind of an S shape, but there's a really, really drastic slope at this section of our graph. Very, very steep. And there's also a kind of more plateaued region of our graph. Okay. This top portion of our graph that's plateaued is basically where your lungs are going to operate at. Okay. Whereas this steep part of our graph is where our tissues operate at. Okay. Well, let me just break down what we're measuring in this graph. On the left, the y-axis for both, we're showing percentage saturation of hemoglobin, so how much oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. On the y-axis, or the x-axis, excuse me, we're measuring PO2. Okay. We've said it several times. As recently as here, we said PO2 in our lungs is about 105. What are we doing with oxygen and hemoglobin in our lungs? Are we loading or unloading? Is oxygen jumping on hemoglobin in our lungs or is it jumping off of hemoglobin? it's jumping on, and that's why we have a dump truck that's full here. Now, since our graph up here is pretty plateaued off, look what happens when we go from like 100 to 80. We're even down to 70. Doesn't really affect saturation a whole lot until we really start to hit, you know, the 50, 60, 40 area all the way down to 20. PO2, we just said in our tissues, is low. It's about 40. That's because our cells are constantly using that oxygen. Well, here's our line up from 40. We are down on the steep part of the graph now. And so in our tissues, we're not wanting to load, but instead we're wanting to unload. Because the oxygen needs to leave the blood and go to our tissues to give those tissues the oxygen that they need, right? Well, once again, demonstrating that I don't like the term deoxygenated blood. I've told you this before, but right now, at rest, like this guy sitting in his recliner, your blood coming back to your right atrium is still about 75% oxygenated. We don't need to dump a whole bunch of oxygen off at rest. But let's say we start to exercise. Our tissues are consuming more oxygen, right? PO2 goes down in our tissues from 40 to 20. 40 to 20 is not a big drop, but it sure is when it comes to saturation. A 20 millimeter mercury difference causes us to unload a lot more. All the way down to about 25%. I told you that just a little bit ago. Even maximal exercise, we're not unloading all oxygen. We're still leaving about a quarter of our oxygen in the blood. So it's a super complicated looking graph, for sure. It's not something I'm going to ask you to be able to kind of walk yourself through. Well, if you can, fantastic. But it does demonstrate some very important things, which includes what promotes loading, what promotes unloading. Now, what's kind of crazy is that curve can actually completely shift to the right or the left. A shift to the right lowers affinity. Affinity, I said, it's the same thing as tightness. So how strongly oxygen is holding on to hemoglobin. Okay. I want you to highlight this. A shift to the right causes greater unloading at our tissues, but less loading in the lungs. So we can't pull as much oxygen into our blood from our lungs, but we're able to pull more oxygen out of the blood, putting it into our tissues. Shifting the curve to the left results in a greater affinity. It's going to hold on tighter. So it's going to promote, and I would highlight this, causes less unloading in our tissues, but greater loading in our lungs. So let's talk about the ways that we can shift the curve to the left or the right. First way to shift the curve is through a what we call Bohr effect, which is caused by changes of blood pH affecting dissociation of that oxyhemoglobin. Dissociation, as it states right there, is promoted by a decrease in pH, like what happens when we exercise and our body is producing lactic acid and carbon dioxide. Thank you. Lactic acid is obviously going to lower your pH, because anytime you have acid, it lowers pH. Looking at our top graph here, the black line in the middle shows normal blood pH is 7.4. 7.2 would be a drop in pH, right? And our red line is showing that the curve is now shifted to the right. We just said what a shift to the right does. Less loading in the lungs, but greater unloading at the tissues. Okay. So here in our red line, about 100 millimeters of mercury. We draw a line across from there. It's about 90% saturated. If we were to draw the line from our black line, it's closer to 97. So there's less loading in the lungs. But down here, draw the line over. Now we've unloaded more than we did at 7.4. So that's what a shift right does. A shift left does the opposite. It promotes more loading. Now we're about 100% saturated. And at that 30 millimeters of mercury PO2, now we're still about 65% saturated. So we don't unload as much to our tissues. Does that make sense? So all this results, like when we exercise, as lactic acid builds up, the blood acidity increases, pH decreases, causing affinity of hemoglobin for O2 to decrease due to the binding of hydrogen ions to hemoglobin. Increasing acidity enhances unloading, resulting in a shift of the curve to the right. As PCO2 rises, this is what we're talking about over here, CO2 forms carbonic acid. We talked about that previously. So a higher PCO2 is going to do the same thing as a drop in pH does. It shifts it to the right, meaning we less load in the lungs, but more unload in our tissues. So far, we've got two things that can cause a shift to the right. I would make it like a list. So write out shift to the right, decreased blood pH, increased blood PCO2. So those two things affect the curve by shifting it right. Shift to the right caused by low or decreased blood pH and high blood PCO2. Temperature can also cause a shift to the right or to the left. Thinking about exercise, which we've been talking about, what happens to body temperature when you exercise? It goes up, right? Pretty standard stuff. Look what a high body temperature does to the curve. It shifts it to the right. And that's great because when we exercise, we need more oxygen, right? How do we get more oxygen? We unload more. So adding to your list, another thing that can shift it to the right is increased body temperature. The acids and the heat produced by metabolically active cells promote the release of O2 from oxyhemoglobin, resulting in a shift of the curve to the right. Now, a shift to the right occurs when our body temperature goes up. When we get cold, we call this hypothermia. We shift it to the left, which means we have a higher amount of binding in our lungs. Loading is high, unloading is low. So during hypothermia, more oxygen remains bound to hemoglobin due to a less need of oxygen by our tissues as cell metabolism slows down. There's a fourth thing that can cause the curve to shift, and this is a chemical called BPG or 2,3-BPG, substance formed by red blood cells when they go through glycolysis, which binds to hemoglobin chains as it builds up in our blood and prevents hemoglobin from binding to O2 tightly. This decreases the affinity of hemoglobin for O2 and causes a shift in the curve to the right. So adding to your list, shift to the curve we said was caused by decreased blood pH, increased blood PCO2, increased body temperature, and now you can just say increased BPG. There will be probably at least one question or two, maybe another one. I'll ask you, which of the following would cause a shift of the curve to the right? You have your four things. Decreased pH, increased PCO2, increased body temperature, and increased BPG. Now, I might ask you, what can cause a shift to the left? If you want to make another list, shift to the left is the reverse of all that. Does that make sense? So what causes a shift to the left? It'd be increased pH, decreased PCO2, decreased body temperature, decreased BPG. Or no BPG as it states it there. And then once again, I told you to highlight it. If you didn't already, make sure you do. Know what the heck a shift to the right means. Lower affinity causing less loading in the lungs, greater unloading in the tissues. Shift to the left results in greater affinity, which means less unloading but greater loading. So definitely star these two bullets. Okay, let's stop here. This is a good spot. We'll pick up with carbon dioxide. I don't want to start it and then have to take a break with it. So we'll stop here. We'll pick up with this next week after we get through our test.